Hello, everyone. What I'd like to do today is to read out a paper to you, one that I wrote a very long time ago. It was shortly after I had finished my bachelor's, and one of the issues that came up repeatedly, almost to the point of unavoidability, uh, during that course of study was uh, marked differences between the analytical and critical approach which uh, schools within continental philosophy seem to have vis-a-vis each other. The reason I foregrounded this way is because there seems to be a blanket uh, division between analytic and continental schools. I very deliberately seem to use these terms in ways that uh, nudge out the Anglophone understanding of them, because what seems to be taught, with, at least in departments in India, as continental philosophy would consist of phenomenology coming from France, the critique of positivism by, again, uh, arising from positivist sociologists that come out of France, and what we are in many ways forecluded out of is any kind of contextualization of such strands of thought in terrains which are not imminent to that historical moment. And please understand that a lot of us are basically reading this in very different circumstances. Like, we read this along with critiques of colonialism and national liberation, and in many ways it becomes a insignificant aspect which a lecturer tries to rush over in a curriculum which is jam packed with exams and stuff. Anyway, that was a unnecessarily belabored introduction, and allow me to basically get to the paper. It's titled Revisiting Structure, Sign and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences, the famous lecture by Derrida, delivered in Johns Hopkins via Capital. Now, I preface this by stating a quote which one of my teachers had basically mentioned in a class which I was attending, and I think I had really questioned him a lot prior to it. He said, "The strength of a discourse is measured by the rigor with which it questions its own premises." This is a professor who I think may still be in that institution, Sanjeev Nandan Prasad. To begin, introduction. In the year 1966, the French philosopher Jacques Derrida delivered a lecture in Johns Hopkins University, which, it would not be an overstatement to say, inaugurated what was to become the advent of post-structuralism into Anglophone departments of cultural studies, comparative literature, history, linguistics, and philology. This inauguration, so to speak, entailed and in many ways advocated a practice of reading and critique which is known to be deconstruction, a project which, it must be said, particularly in retrospect, suffered deviations into directions and employments not appreciated either by much of the more robustly entrenched scientific vantages represented by the likes of Alan Sokal, a physicist responsible for the humorously infamous Sokal affair, footnoted in the paper, nor the more politically motivated currents within the academic establishment, such as the German sociologist Jürgen Habermas and the American literary scholar Frederick Jameson, both whom distanced themselves from and critiqued deconstruction on the grounds that it was overtly intellectualist and disassociated from the forces of history and class struggle. Of course, these are gross injustices in terms of my characterizations, and you're welcome to follow through and pick up the strands of their respective critiques. In getting back to the paper, far too much ink has been spilt on these respective critiques and the numerous rejoinders they have instigated, and any curious mind willing to unwrap their intricacies will find directions in the footnotes. The purpose of this intervention, however, is to point out what is, in the opinion of this student, I think this was maybe 2014, 2015. Anyway, what is in the opinion of this student a fundamental lacunae in that fateful inauguration itself. Here, I refer to the bold declaration that, in quotes, perhaps something has occurred in the history of the concept of structure that could be called an event, if this loaded word did not entail a meaning which it is precisely the function of structural or structuralist thought to reduce or to suspect. But let me use the term event anyway, employing it with caution and as if in quotation marks, in this sense. This event will have the exterior form of a rupture and a redoubling. Derrida, 1966. The grounds of an injunction. Here it is important to note the extent of the argument being made, for the field of its referent is the history of Western science and philosophy. An event which is to bear the mark of a rupture and a redoubling. What, however, may be the use of such history of the concept of structure, an earnest pragmatist may ask, to which Derrida pushes further. Nevertheless, this is in quotes, up until the event which I wish to mark out and define, structure, or rather the structurality of structure, although it has always been involved, has always been neutralized or reduced, and this is by a process of giving it a center or referring it to a point of presence, a fixed origin. The function of this center was not only to orient, balance, and organize the structure. One cannot, in fact, conceive of an unorganized structure, but above all to make sure that the organizing principle of the structure would limit what we might call the free play of the structure. We will probe what this may concretely mean a little later, but it is important to note that in drawing a hypothesis between the relation of the center to a structure, Derrida also draws a hypothesis between the relation of the structure to a center. In quotes again, nevertheless, the center also closes off the free play it opens up and makes it possible. Qua center, it is the point at which the substitution of contents, elements, or terms is no longer possible. At the center, the permutation or the transformation of elements, which may of course be structures enclosed within a structure, is forbidden. At least this permutation has always remained interdicted. This is from the same lecture that was delivered by Derrida. The lecture would go on to cite the work of the anthropologist Levi Strauss with particular attention to how he struggles with and problematizes the distinction between nature and culture, perhaps one of the oldest in the human sciences. Later, philosophical development on a historical scale has been astute in following the discursive possibilities opened up by the attempt to think the moment of rupture and the forms of cultural fragmentations and subjective recompositions it entails for a socius. This has perhaps reached its apogee in Derrida's French compatriot Alain Badiou's philosophical exposition of how a truth becomes immanent to a time in the form of a recognition which calls for a naming, an act which entails a fidelity. Yet, what was to become of the notion of a center if it itself can no longer claim the grounds of any transcendental unifying synthesis in a Kantian fashion? For as it has been employed within the dawn of an Anglophone reception of post-structuralism, I'm referring here to the lecture, 66, John Hopkins, its function seems to have been to point to the condition of its very exclusion from the domain that it structures. Or, as Derrida put it, in quotes, thus it has always been thought that the center, which by its definition unique, constituted that very thing within a structure which governs the structure, while escaping structurality. This is why classical thought concerning structure could say that the center is, paradoxically, within the structure and outside it. The center is the center of the totality, and yet, since the center does not belong to the totality, is not part of the totality has its center elsewhere. The center is not the center. The concept of centered structure, although it represents coherence itself, the condition of the episteme as philosophy or science, is contradictorily coherent. And, as always, coherence in contradiction expresses the force of a desire. The concept of centered structure is in fact the concept of a free play based on a fundamental ground, a free play which is constituted upon a fundamental immobility and a reassuring certitude, which is itself beyond the reach of the free play. With this certitude, anxiety can be mastered, for anxiety is invariably the result of a certain mode of being implicated in the game, of being caught by the game, of being, as it were, from the very beginning, at stake in the game. This is a quote from the same lecture. The disavowed question of magnitude. The naming or the identification of this relation is what Derrida has called the moment when the structurality of structure has begun to be thought. However, there is another way in which this relation, the positing of a center which serves as a mediating adjudicator, while itself remaining beyond their substitutability, has emerged, immanent to the discourse of the human sciences. That is, Marx's theory of the expression of value in his critique of political economy. To begin with, Marx points out the emergence and interplay between use and exchange value as products of human labor. 20 yards of linen, for example, may be used to be woven into a coat. Let us write this as 20L is equal to 1C. The form of the equivalence expressed here is the simple use value of 20 yards of linen in terms of what it may be possible to do with it in being subject to human labor. The linen expressed its value in the coat. The coat serves as the material in which the value is expressed. Is a quote. To be able to appreciate what such a beginning enables, it is essential to cognize how any such equation is an expression of equivalent magnitudes as products of human labor. as it predicates how much of linen is transformed by human labor to make a coat, or, to put it in terms which Marx deploys, what may be the necessary magnitude of linen required for its use value to be equivalent to that needed to make a coat. Marx calls this the elementary form of value, as the form of equivalence entailed in such an equation predicates the simple use of materials to human labor in their transformation by it. In such an expression, which predicates magnitudes, however, there is a necessity entailed of it being subject to every change in the productiveness of weaving or tailoring. As process of production, they are autonomous of each other. If, for example, as Marx points out, due to the infertility of soil, the labor time necessary for the production of linen is doubled, the value of the linen will also be doubled. In which case the equation would be changed from 20 yards of linen make a coat to 20 yards of linen are perhaps equivalent to 2 coats. How is this possible? If a coat was still to require 20 yards of linen to make, because were the labor required to weave 20 yards of linen to be twice as dear on account of poor soil, for instance, its acquisition would have to be proportionately compensated for. The form of equivalence entailed in such an equation, if you notice, is no longer merely the simple use of the material, but on account of the changes has to take into account what caused them, and has changed from an expression of simple use values of the magnitudes of materials to human labor to the relative exchange values of materials or commodities for human labor. I'm repeating. If you notice, this is no longer merely the simple use of the material, but on account of the changes has to take into account what caused them, and has changed from an expression of simple use values of the magnitudes of materials to human labor to the relative exchange values of materials or commodities for human labor. This is called by Marx the quantitative determination of relative value. I think this is a brilliant conception, for it permits that the value of the commodity or service in question may be relative, but by the same token seeks to understand how the change from its previous value came to be in its quantitative dimensions. What a philosopher may note, however, is the movement of the transmutation of equivalences as noted above, from the elementary form of value to the quantitative determination of relative value. This is a more sophisticated step, for it traces not merely the change in the material commensurability of the value of a product from simple use to an article of exchange, but presents also why any change in the relative dearness of a product would have to be accounted for in the relations necessary for its production. This is representative of the form of Marx's scientific exposition, known as dialectical materialism, which, in its final analysis, is a theory of historical change. It is at this step, however, that the paradox of magnitude actually reveals itself. For what is to happen when we ask what the value of 40 yards of linen would be? 4 coats? This arises because when the form of value changes as demonstrated above, perhaps a step which Derrida seems to mark as an event where the structurality of structure has come to be thought, we are uncertain how to treat the principle. Would it remain within the ambit of a simple use value, or does its essence already belong to the domain of exchange values? For while 2 into 20 yards of linen would be equal to 2 into 2 coats, which would make 40 yards of linen is equal to 4 coats, the body of a coat can now no longer express its use value independently of what plays the part of an equivalent of value or equivalent form of value. In other words, the linen required to tailor the coat would still have to be weaved and tailored. And would the soil to be added for a season, it would be much harder to raise the crop, and all of this even before the weaving or tailoring begins. Further, the above expression, to be complete, cannot leave out the transaction between the farmer, the weaver and the tailor, who are almost always separate people. What is it that makes this exchange commensurable? This is how the requirement of an equivalent form of value for such products of human labor is demonstrated. However, the magnitude of any body's value, such as a coat, is determined independently of the form of its expression as a value, i.e., flax, weaving, linen, tailoring, coat. It's determined, the form of its expression as a value is determined by the labor time necessary for its production. At this point, I would like to clarify that Marx is operating very much within the conceptual apparatus of classical political economy, where any product which is desired not to be consumed by a proprietor is considered a commodity which he or she may seek to exchange in the market, drawing on Adam Smith's definition. It is this enigmatic characteristic of the equivalent form of value which slips undetected under the radar of bourgeois political economy, undetected until it is confronted by itself in its fully developed form as money. This dialectical paradox was not lost, however, upon perhaps the first critical and empirically grounded thinker, the sober Athenian Aristotle, who, in the first place, this is a quote, clearly enunciates that the money form of commodities is only the further development of the simple form of value. For he says that 5 beds is equal to a house, is not to be distinguished from 5 beds is equal to X amount of money, as it is effectively the material substance which facilitates the possibility of the equivalence and commensurability of these goods as values. The incorporeality of the equivalent form, or the absent center, as the anchor and grounds of a discourse. The expanded form of value this follows the implication of the equivalent form to its conclusion. In an equation where it is possible to represent the magnitude of value of any commodity in the form of its equivalent magnitude of value of any other commodity, linen for example, 20 yards of linen is equal to a coat, or 10 pounds of tea, or 40 pounds of coffee, or a quarter of corn, etc. Provided that we understand that what is now actually being equated is no longer any physical property of the material or commodity in question, but magnitudes of abstract labor time required for their production, given the prevalent state of technological advancement which facilitates this production. For this would be the only other variable which would affect the magnitude of their value, examples being the given productive and advancements in tailoring and weaving, etc. It is perhaps now that we may better appreciate what perhaps drives the heart of Derrida's intervention in the history of philosophy. Do not make too fine a point between that and metaphysics, as it may have been fashionable to do by the French in the late 20th century. Bearing in mind that this constituted at most an introduction to the mode of thought, to disciplinary practices much in danger of being swamped into Anglo-Saxon classicisms of insular indulgences, which always reveal themselves in their reifications of aesthetics, for example, from politics, and economics from history, and perhaps most pertinently for Derrida, philosophy from literature. And it is in following perhaps the spirit of such an endeavor that I return to what may yet be called a rupture and a redoubling. Yet a rupture and a redoubling which not merely displaces the center, so to speak, in a linguistic substitutability of signifiers, which delays and displaces the elusive aletheia of meaning, a la deconstruction, but predicates the magnitude of the displacement in question. For, as we have observed, it is the predication of magnitudes which provides us with evidence indicating how the form of equivalence itself is changing. It is the transmutation of this form of equivalence which drives Marx's method, that is perhaps partly lost on Derrida, as apparent in, I quote, its matrix, the history of metaphysics is the determination of being as presence, in all senses of this word. It would be possible to show that all the names related to fundamentals, to principles, or to the center have always designated the constants of a presence, eidos, archi, telos, energia, ousia, in translating to essence, existence, substance, subject, aletheia, transcendentality, consciousness or conscience, God, man, and so forth. It is to his credit, however, Derrida's, that he acknowledges and anticipates what the function of central signifiers are to be, as well as the peculiarity of their deployment, characterized by a substitutability perhaps best exemplified in the manner of a dictionary, where the only grounds of predicating a signifier are at best other signifiers, provided that they are recognized by a speech community. It is, however, as I have tried to show, the magnitude of this recognition which facilitates the historical predication of discourses around singular signifiers, which, so to speak, are barred from, yet enable the very play of structurality they escape. The execution of the law in the name of justice, for example, would never subject justice itself to its procedurality. The institution of organized religions are perhaps emblematic of this in their banking of their position as intermediaries between the faithful and the constancy of the presence which they are supposedly in communion with. Again, and perhaps more pronouncedly, there are important distinctions to be noted between the implication of the incorporeality of the equivalent form and the absent center as the anchor and grounds of a discourse. Of greatest significance is the fact that the equivalent form is by necessity interminable, because the chain of value represented by an equation such as 20 yards of linen is equal to 1 coat, or 10 pounds of tea, or 40 pounds of coffee, or a quarter of corn, etc., is furnished with the materials for a new expression of value with every new kind of commodity that comes into existence. It is hence operative within the unique condition later named by Ernst Bloch uh, in relation to Marx, uh, called ontological incompleteness. Uh, in a sense, it refers to the non-being of the posited uh, substance or commodity which it refers to, though ontology is something that you can look up on your own. I will leave that for you, whose derivation and implication we may venture to on a later date. It is hence perhaps properly presented as 20 yards of linen is equal to 1 coat, or 10 pounds of tea, or 40 pounds of coffee, or a quarter of corn, comma, bracket open, ellipsis, bracket close, i.e. a null set, where the null set represents commodities which are as of yet unrealized. This is to bear striking significance for the act of naming, which again is perhaps better left for a subsequent venture. Keeping in mind that such an equation represents an economic transaction, what would be the implication of the form of equivalence it now enables? If a person were to exchange the magnitude of value of 10 pounds of tea for the magnitude of value of 20 yards of linen, then it follows that the person who now has the 10 pounds of tea could exchange it for a coat or 40 pounds of coffee, etc. It is here that we first observe how the magnitude of socially determined labor time expressed in the value of a commodity congeals into a currency that is as a standard of value which guarantees and predicates a magnitude of socially determined labor time, which functions as the form of equivalence for all other commodities, i.e. money. A form which, while representative of the labor required to produce a commodity, put simplistically, bears only exchange value and is of no use to anyone in itself. Material sublation, or the negative of the one no more. The remainder which this process of dialectical sublation leaves us with is the nascent form of capital, an expression of value produced by and derived from the social relations of labor, which becomes, via the process of the circulation of the product of their labor, a form of equivalences between commodities, which were produced, however, by a form of cooperation between laborers. The 20 yards of linen dissolved into the air, and its spectre, the germ of the value form as capital, appears. This is the most important step in understanding the alienation of labor by capital. At such a juncture, there are important questions which are to be raised, such as, is capital a teleology, i.e. an inevitability, or does it simply appear as such at a given moment of historical development? For, like the unfinished equation of the equivalent form, we do not know how history shall develop with regards to the mode of production, and perhaps we may yet witness a kind of production, circulation, and distribution which does not function within the parameters of such a logic. What has been attempted in the ambit of this essay, however, is a necessity felt by me to chart a path of communicability between two styles of thought, both products of their given historico-political circumstances, which yet perhaps draw surprisingly close at unique moments, while yet bearing striking differences. This is done while making it amply clear where I may lean towards dialectical predications and why so, an attempt I was impelled towards largely out of their present reifications from each other in cultural linguistic studies and political economy departments, whom are often content to try and explain their intellectual and methodological differences in terms which foreclose the possibility of appreciating how and where they may meet or diverge, and the consequences that such decisions are to entail in their respective lines of thought. So I believe that this is a is certainly not a virgin field, but it's one that requires some degree of probing and interrogation, and to see as to whether it can produce the metaphors and lenses which we may draw from in our analysis of everyday life, transactions, uh, labor relations, and the economy. I do think that given its original uh, inspirations coming from deconstruction and Derrida, you would be well advised to see as to whether you could read literary texts in trying to think of questions such as what sustains uh, the conjugality or the sense of familialhood between relations encountered in a novel between characters, and whether you are able to posit a name to the form or the characteristics of such relations. And in drawing from the background of the plot, are you able to be able to glean in the ways in which two characters may interact, for example, aspects which they seem to identify with, or rather choose to identify with, and what they would want to leave out? And is there something that you see in the narrative which tells you why they do so? That would be the deconstructive reading. And it would be interesting to be able to read literature that way, and maybe perhaps also history, because choices, of course, are always political at some level. That aside, well, within the sphere of commerce, this in many ways slides under the table. I mean, almost all the products that you buy, everything from the sabzi mandi onwards, already has a price which a shopkeeper is willing to bargain for on the spot for it, if not an MRP tag stamped on the product itself, uh, sold by weight, etc. Yet, were you to not be the person making the sale or the purchase, you may be a bystander on the road. You may perhaps witness what allows a shopkeeper to charge the same amount of money for a pan or a matchbox or like four matchboxes. And if you begin to start thinking their commensurability in a relation for someone who is trading in them, uh, then you will perhaps get to a kind of equivalence in a magnitude. And that's something that Marx was trying to organically present to you in the form of the development of its logic. And it's there that I think the strength of the first three chapters of Capital really lies, if you are interested in reading about it. Now, as strands of thought, these are almost always divorced from each other, given very marked differences between how the French and German schools of philosophy and the social sciences have developed. Yet I think this was a great occasion to bring them together, to chart out their differences and their similarities in terms of the kinds of questions they were addressing. And their reception in the Anglophone world, which seems to determine what their respective sense of uh, precedence would be. Anyway, that aside, my throat is getting sore. I will ask you to read the paper. I will leave a highlighted link in the uh, description. If you have questions, comments, observations, criticism, I would certainly welcome it. And hey, thank you for your time. Hopefully, if you appreciate videos like this, you could give me a thumbs up, maybe share it, and I will come back to you with something else, hopefully drawing on an observation or a question. All right, bye bye. Good night.